Good afternoon, everyone. And for those in the Philippines, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. It's a pleasure to have you here. And this is an auspicious date because Nicole's not only giving a talk, we are also launching the Philippine edition of her book. And this is a kind of welcome to Ateneo Press. It's a great thing to be published with Ateneo Press. I myself can speak to the fact that it is attest to the fact that it is one of the greatest honors for a Filipinist to be published with Ateneo Press. So without further ado, our speaker today is Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz, who received her Ph.D. in history from Yale University. She is currently a research fellow at the University of Cambridge and executive director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation. She is originally from the Philippines, and I think she is in the Philippines right now, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on the new book, Nicole.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. It's a very big honor. I'll begin sharing my screen. I think I can. There. All right. So just to note that I'll be sailing through this history, and lots of names will be unfamiliar and their roles unexplained. However, for our purposes, it's the ideas and language that matter. So I warn and reassure you not to worry if the precise historical actors and historical timelines remain unclear at the end of this talk. The important global moment of the late 19th century, with all the changes in technology, sovereignty, human exchange, and ideology that it brought, is too often apprehended in Asian historiography through a bilateral framework privileging relations with the West. For example, with studies of, on the one hand, Vietnam and France, and on the other, the Philippines and the US. The long Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1905, which began against Spain and continued against the United States of America, took place against a backdrop of imperial incorporation and local resistance that was truly region-wide. This backdrop includes, I'll just sail through this, the French conquest of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos, and the creation of French Indochina by 1897, and in response, the 1885 to 1888 Con Vuong movement in the country that would become Vietnam, a contemporaneous anti-French revolt in Cambodia, and the 1903 to 1905 activism of the Vietnamese scholar gentry, as well as full extension of direct Dutch colonial rule throughout the Netherlands East Indies from 1872 to 1910 against stiff resistance, especially in Aceh, the centralization of British power in the Federated Malay States from the 1890s to the 1910s, the British annexation of Upper Burma following the Third Anglo-Burmese War in 1885, the incorporation of Burma as a province of British India by 1897, and the formation of the Burmese nationalist movement continuing into the 1920s. This era also saw the emergence of Japan as a non-Western imperial power after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the early exertion of its dominance over Korea in 1876, which culminated in the annexation of Korea in 1910, as well as the Japanese annexation and incorporation of Taiwan beginning in 1895. Yet this important transnational and regional historical setting has barely been incorporated into the locally and Western-oriented historiography of the Philippine Revolution. The historical literature treats the Philippine Revolution as if it happened in a completely different corner of the world entirely, without reference to this transnational regional setting at all. Indeed, my ongoing focus on the Asian context of Philippine history runs counter to the traditional assumption of the literature, the assumption that the Filipino self-image is historically non-Asian, seeing itself as belonging to the Western Hemisphere. Early post-war and Cold War Southeast Asian studies, such as D.G. Hall's seminal works, excluded the Philippines from studies of the region entirely. Meanwhile, internationalization of the Philippine Revolution's historiography has generally occurred along imperial lines, analyzing it with or against the former Western imperial powers or the former colonies of Spain and the US, such as Puerto Rico. My book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, on which this paper is based, is the first work to deeply contextualize Philippine revolutionary and political thought in the intellectual ferment and international contests of power then brewing in Southeast and East Asia. Though the talk I'm about to present to you today does not have time to do so, my book opens a comparison between the contemporaneous Vietnamese scholar gentry political opposition in French Indochina with that of the Ilustrados and Katipuneros in the Philippines. Today, I'll focus on discussing the construction of Asia and the presence of Asianism in the founding of the Filipino Nation and the history of the Philippine Revolution. Until the propaganda movement of the Ilustrado Filipinos, who were the educated elite, began constructing their idea of the Filipino nation in the 1880s, no concept of Filipino yet existed. Their work was largely channeled through the European-based fortnightly newspaper La Solidaridad, and in this process, the propaganda movement inscribed the new Philippine nation within a more ancient Asian landscape, imbued with civilizational importance recognizable even to Europeans, rather than arising on an island with no visible ancient ruins or historical grandeur. The propagandists apparently thought this association with an older, richer, documented civilizational realm necessary due to the visible lack of ancient kingdoms and ruins around which Filipinos could assemble their own unique Filipinized nationalism. For example, the propagandists sought to recover their Tagalog language, a member of the Malayo-Polynesian linguistic family, as a marker of autonomy and identity. The propagandists developed a Tagalog orthography. Filipino national hero Jose Rizal wrote to fellow propagandist Mariano Ponce excitedly in 1888, quote, "The new Tagalog orthography that we are using is perfectly in accord with the ancient writing and with the Sanskrit origin of many Tagalog words, as I found out through my research in the British Museum," end quote. Thus, this act of recovery succeeded not only in effecting a symbolic separation from Spain, but also restored Tagalog to its pre-colonial Asian world. In La Solidaridad, Asia largely appears as constructed through the history of civilization and is noted for its heights of achievement, albeit in a defensive tone. An important feature in this construction of Asia through the history of civilization was the premise that there is something like universal civilization, and that it merely passed from one incarnation to another, from east to west and back again. This ephemeral unitary concept of civilization formed the mechanism by which the Ilustrado's civilizational construction of Asia reconciled itself with the history of the rise and fall of great powers and the current state of material inequality between East and West. It's interesting to note that this is precisely the theoretical premise that would later characterize World War II wartime Japanese-sponsored President Jose P. Laurel's historical and political thinking, and that grounded his Pan-Asianism. From this generalized Asia, we can move to specificities of place, to which end I wish to read from a poem. Quote, "A plant I am that's scarcely grown was torn from out its eastern bed, where all around perfume is shed, and life but as a dream is known," end quote. These are the opening lines of a poem by Rizal written in 1882 in Madrid for his mother. Though Filipinas, by which term I refer to the Spanish colony before the creation of the Philippine nation, had barely known its own surroundings and taken root, having scarcely grown, it was located firmly within the cradle of the East, its eastern bed. Moreover, there is something seemingly destined to a form of development rooted at home in Asia, while the work to uproot the Philippines from its eastern bed was presented as unnatural. The eastern bed of perfume and dreams was not only natural, but also Edenic. Many Western empires premised their conquest and civilizing mission on the enshrinement of a certain idea, a manifestation of reason, as endowing them with the right to rule, whether the due earthly dominion of Christianity under the Spanish or the technological capacity to till the land and assume true ownership over it under the British. As such, some of the strongest critics of various empires rested their arguments on place, on the legitimate affective ties of place and group, with these affinities providing in and of themselves claim to rule. Place figures this political and affective plane as a decidedly non-universal plane upon which to attach and organize a geography of political affinity in the manner of Edmund Burke. Burke's understanding of place was both territorial, the significance of a particular physical space with its history, land, rivers, and monuments, and social, involving origins, distinctions, social position. In his understanding, place gave location to individual and collective identities and related both kinds of identities to one another. Place was movable, serving as a localized counterpoint to the universal Enlightenment ideals that so often animated non-Western nationalism and nation states in this period, and yet could seem insufficiently specific on their own. It is thus also a window through which one may see the Asian and Asianist nationalisms that mobilize place as something other than merely a co-opting of Western formulations of the nation state and its foundational ideals, though that work was also underway. Anti-colonial nationalists in Asia at the turn of the 20th century grounded their Enlightenment-influenced ideals in a politics and ideology of place that brought imagined historical, cultural, and racial specificity and logics to bear upon their nationalisms, and argued that such affective rootedness was their source of political legitimacy. Place provided an entry point for nationalisms constructed in universalist Western grammar to become particularized and specified, even exceptionalized in certain imaginations. They thus also opened articulations of anti-colonial nationalism to natural interpretations of race and geographic belonging. At a speech in honor of Señor Becerra, a liberal Spanish statesman, in 1890, reprinted in La Solidaridad, Graciano López Jaena invoked place, geography, and the environment as a language through which to highlight the vulnerability of imported culture. Quote, "Remember one thing more, gentlemen. It is now an incontrovertible fact that there was a time when the Philippines formed part of Asia. It was separated to form an archipelago and therefore will not be reunited again, nor will it disappear. But on its surface, great changes frequently occur due to the fact that water, which is filtered across those layers of clay, lime, and volcanic soil, gets to the spheroidal state and to a temperature higher than that of water vapor. It acquires tremendous force, seeks the line of least resistance, and destroys and sweeps away everything," end quote. This was a warning that without reforms to stabilize foreign civilizational and cultural transformations, a place can and will exert force through its own older natural forms, for that is the line of least resistance, the one that is natural and foundational. La Solidaridad's newspaper's poetry eulogized this place's rivers, to which it imputed an automatic knowledge and affinity on the part of the Filipinos, and as theorizations on race attributed unique developments arising from its climate and environment. The poem Los Cantos del Pasig by Rafael Ginar de la Rosa, published in La Solidaridad in 1893, uses the river of the Pasig in a Tagalog-speaking region to help ground Filipino place, stirring Filipino feeling and indeed constructing it through a shared reference seemingly bereft of class and division, upon which could rest the kind of collective leveling premise required for an emergent nationalism. "Son of the Pasig, your brown face dreams peacefully of this shady woods in the simple house of your love." Filipino nationalism here, which is related to place and to the natural, subtly introduces race, your brown face, which the Ilustrados understood as related to the adaptive evolution and attuned to one's particular environment and climate. Such a particularized evolution only makes place that much more natural and important, embedded as it is in one's historical racial development. Yet despite La Solidaridad's best efforts, the Pasig River was not yet metonymic and unable to substitute for the nationalism or nation it was meant to symbolize, particularly at this point when regional and ethno-linguistic divisions would have painted the reference as decidedly Tagalog and urban rather than Filipino. The Katipunan in the lead up to the Philippine Revolution would take this grounding primacy of place a step further, invoking Inang Bayan, or mother country. From a location within a civilizational Asia to a specific grounding in place, the last relevant geography of political affinity is the Ilustrados' construction of the Malay race. The Filipino nationalist writings of the period commonly referred to Filipinos as belonging to the Malay race and used evidence found in European scholarship to argue that Filipinos were of Malay civilization in their languages, customs, religious beliefs, social institutions, psychology, and cultural practices. This emphasis on being part of the Malay race was a way to counter Spanish and European thinkers who described the archipelago as overrun by an anarchy of tribes and races. Rizal declared himself to be Malayo Tagalog, and in his 1890 annotations to the Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas por el Dr. Antonio de Morga, explored hypotheses of shared racial and civilizational origins for Filipinos with Sumatrans, Polynesians, and even Japanese. Rizal's Paris-based organization Indios Bravos agreed on a secret agenda of liberating first the Philippines, then Borneo, Indonesia, and Malaya. Facing Spanish persecution, Rizal spent a week in 1892 traveling through Sandakan, Borneo, in present-day Malaysia, to seek a land grant from the British government to establish a Filipino colony at home amongst their purported racial brothers. La Solidaridad reinforced the Filipino connection to the larger Malay world throughout its issues, casually reporting new Malay publications and studies as part of Filipinas' assumed sphere of interest and concern. In an 1895 article, La Solidaridad proudly declared, quote, "The Japanese are Malay and the Filipino inhabitants are Malay, and those who have closely studied the Malay race and its ancient civilization cannot cast aside the qualities of nobility and virility that characterize the Malay," end quote. It also hotly challenged the idea that the Filipinos were not Malay. Mariano Ponce dedicated an article to the Spanish writer Vicente Barrantes, and in it wrote, quote, "His Excellency has the nerve to say that the Malay element is not exclusive, not even preponderant in the Philippines. To what race then do the Filipinos belong? All the ethnographers of the world would be grateful to His Excellency if he were to surprise us with the news that the natives, with the exception of the Negritos, do not belong to the Malay race. And not only the scholars would be grateful, but even the children of the primary schools of Austria and Germany, because they know from their teachers. End quote. The deep offense taken at Barantes' assertion reveals just how much the Ilustrados' civilizational and racial pride depended upon their identification with the Malays. It also underscores the instability of these racial constructions and how global hierarchies and international perceptions of civilizational achievement were deeply implicated in their constructed nationalism, even as the Ilustrados claimed to disavow them. Indeed, the easy disavowal of the Negritos, which was the blanket term for the nativist, animist tribal Filipinos in Ponce's article, evidences the implicit workings of an internalized sense of hierarchy. The Negritos of the Philippines were either a liability to the Ilustrados' quest to win political and civilizational recognition for the Filipinos, or an easy instrument by which to shore up their own racial superiority. A way to say to Europe, nuance your denigration of Filipinos. Your stereotypes may fit them, but not us. Writing from Paris in 1888, Filipino painter Juan Luna wrote Jose Rizal, quote, "Tell me about your travel impressions, especially about your stay in Japan, whose people is so attractive to me. I'm an enthusiastic admirer of their painting, and I think that it is as advanced as that of Greece and Italy. We should study more that country whom we resemble so much," end quote. While in Japan, Rizal was reportedly taken for a Japanese man. Further, in his contribution to Trubner's record in 1889, Rizal compared the Tagalog and Japanese versions of the fable of the tortoise and the monkey and suggested a possible Malay origin of the Japanese people. While in Japan, he formed a romantic relationship with a young woman, Osei-san. Yet in the pages of the propagandist newspaper, La Solidaridad, Japan appears less a kindred Malay relative to the Filipinos, despite protestations to that effect, than an alternate future or an alternate vision of possibility, one made possible precisely through this resemblance that Luna and Rizal assert. This resemblance we can assume to be geographical, for the Japanese were largely unlike the Filipinos except through their common location in an Asia beset by Western imperialism and through a geographic construction of an Asian race. Meanwhile, José Rizal asserted in his famous article Sobre la Inocencia de los Filipinos in 1890 that the Spanish government itself recognized racial similarity and affinity not only between the Filipinos and other Malays, but also with the Japanese. Quote, "Fearing to have the Filipinos deal frequently with other individuals of their own race who were free and independent, as the Borneans, the Siamese, the Cambodians, and the Japanese, people who in their customs and feelings differ greatly from the Chinese, the government acted towards these others with great mistrust and great severity until they finally ceased to come to the country," end quote. The ethnic Chinese commercial minority in Filipinas was a target of prejudice in the pages of La Solidaridad. There are repeated references in the paper to differences between the Malay Filipinos and their Cynic neighbors in Asia, particularly regarding Cynic vice. Thus, in this interpretation, the Chinese stood apart from the rest of Asia, while the Japanese stood with the Southeast Asians and Filipinos racially and culturally, even though the Japanese were integrated members of the Cynic world. The inclusion of the Japanese but not the Chinese on these terms seems a difficult paradox to reconcile, particularly given the mixed Chinese ethnicity of the propagandists themselves, except through the propagandist's desire to aggrandize the Filipino by claiming the Japanese as among their racial kind, while holding a status superior to the pure, culturally unassimilated Chinese immigrants in their midst, in the same manner as the Spanish did. While employing race as a category and treating races as real, the Ilustrados argued against a fixed ranking of the races, arguing for a multilinear evolutionism rather than a deterministic orthogenetic Darwinism. However, their use of racial categories had its own hierarchizing logic and involved responses to Western practices of ranking that only served to legitimize the framework of that hierarchizing, as their complex relationship with their own Chinese and animist Filipino tribal brothers illustrates. In Filipinas Dentro de 100 Años, Rizal's famous 1889 article, he discussed his effort to reawaken Filipinos who, quote, "forgot their writings, their songs, their poetry, their laws, in order to learn by heart other doctrines which they did not understand, other ethics, other tastes, different from those inspired in their race by their climate and their way of thinking," end quote. His mention of climate and consonant ways of thinking carved into race a certain natural and concrete reality. Here, race is not merely a social construction. Further, it is inalienable from the place in which it evolved with its particular climate and evolutionary thread. This understanding transforms what would otherwise be a leveling effect, as one would expect the workings of heat upon all people of all races living in Filipinas to be the same, into a racial attribute and distinguisher. In adapting to a different racist civilization, meanwhile, Rizal saw in the Filipino subject position the ability to recognize civilization and to negotiate with and thrive in the world before it. Within the Ilustrados framework of multilinear evolutionism, this racial ability to adapt and absorb from others strengthened the Filipinos' potential, with the ability to adapt to others being an evolutionary trait that the white Europeans supposedly did not have in the same store. Now I turn from this general Asianism to a more specific Pan-Asianism. Pan-Asian discourse, which emanated mainly from Japan and China, advocated Asian solidarity under the aid of Japan against encroachments of Western imperialism, internalizing a loose belief in a vague evolutionary social Darwinism, in which mutual aid and cooperation amongst those of like races and cultures would allow for better competition in what they perceived to be a global competition of survival of the fittest amongst nations. The mainstream thread of Japanese Pan-Asian thought was Sinocentric, and the discourse stressed cultural unity based on common use of Chinese characters, a purported racial kinship of East Asian peoples and ethnicities, the compact geography and specific historical legacy of the Sinocentric order that forged interstate relations and economic ties across East Asia, and the understanding of a common destiny in an Asian struggle against Western imperialism, and at times against Westernization or even modernization. There was also the Tejas thread, which focused on an Asia as one thesis, which was more inclusive, and a Meishuron thread, which was a more muscular ideology in which Japan sought to lead and remake Asia in its own image. And these are just the three main threads. It's a very, very multivocal, discrepant discourse that we don't need to go into in detail now. The idea of a common destiny was the intellectual vehicle that Southeast Asian Pan-Asianists used to challenge the mainstream cynic delimitation of Pan-Asianism. In the more radical threads of Pan-Asianism and among their adherents in the periphery, outside Japan, the Asia and Pan-Asianism would come to include all of oppressed Asia writ large. This was particularly true after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, but began as early as the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 for Filipino Asianists and nationalists. The existing literature attends to the successive failures to transnationalize Pan-Asianism within the cynic world, highlighting Japanese-Chinese rivalry and the failure to extend Pan-Asianism to Korea. But it ignores the Pan-Asianism of the non-cynic periphery. The revolutionary First Philippine Republic's foreign collaboration represents the first instance of fellow Pan-Asianists lending material aid toward anti-colonial revolution against a Western power, rather than the overthrow of a domestic dynasty, and harnessing transnational Pan-Asian networks of support, activism, and association toward doing so. This material dimension is crucial to understanding the Pan-Asianism of the colonized periphery and to incorporating the periphery into this history. So too is the affective dimension, in which fantasies, imagination, and asserted emotionality form much of the periphery's engagement with the model of Meiji-era Japan and Asian solidarity. My book argues for the importance of both dimensions as lenses through which the Pan-Asianism of the periphery can be recognized and made legible to the workings of the center. What was the Philippine Pan-Asian vision? The Filipino Asianist Asianism was multidimensional, providing a civilizational and racial buttress to their formulations of nation and rightful self-rule within a global social Darwinist framework, and assisting in a regrounding of place as the basis for rightful political sovereignty in their anti-colonialism. Their explicit Pan-Asian vision, meanwhile, was diverse, pragmatic, and loose, centered on Japanese material aid and leadership, which involved directly learning from Japan's successful social Darwinist adaptation to preserve its native Asian culture while integrating modern innovations, and forming a solidarity union of Asian nations and races in what was perceived to be a coming race war. The Filipino Asianists saw themselves in the revolution as leading the charge toward an anti-colonial future within colonized Asia, leading what they saw as brethren Malay nations toward that shared vision and working alongside the modern leader of Japan. To that end, their Pan-Asian vision involved both the explicitly nationalist goals of the constituent nations, as well as the realpolitik internationalist vision of racial solidarity within a loose, regional, transnational Pan-Asian organization. Indeed, because of the racialized social Darwinist frame through which they interpreted the international sphere, they believed nationalism and racialized internationalism to be existentially and pragmatically necessary. When Rizal gave up on the propaganda movement in Europe and returned to Asia in 1892, having decided that the appropriate battlefield was at home, it marked the beginning of a new phase to the anti-colonial struggle. The propaganda movement that began in 1875 was ultimately abandoned by many who gave up on the slow work of publishing arguments for reform. As revolutionaries and anti-colonial thinkers faced increasing Spanish crackdown in Filipinas, they moved to Hong Kong, Singapore, and especially Yokohama, where they would harness anti-colonial Pan-Asianist networks in an attempt to aid the Philippine Revolution. The Katipunan, the secret society that would begin the Philippine Revolution upon the failure of the propaganda movement that came before it, was a direct intellectual inheritor of this work by the propaganda movement to construct an Asian Philippine nation. And one finds precisely this propagandist theoretical argumentation, emphasis on the Philippines' Asian heritage, and turn towards Japan as a new symbol of power in the writings, initiation rites, and private letters of the Katipuneros and the revolutionaries of the First Philippine Republic. While the Katipunan looked back to the Filipinos' pre-colonial civilization and history, much like the propagandists did, it did not seek to resurrect the native past or indigenous customs. The revolution's intellectual history was international in framework. More specifically, the revolution was attuned to the modern colonized world and to Asia. The Katipuneros perceived their own battle as part of a wider transnational war. They cheered the rebels in Cuba, wanted to establish a presence in Hong Kong, and sought aid from Japan. The Katipunan understood Philippine history as part of Asian history, and they located Filipinas' pre-colonial condition of independence and autonomy as occurring within the temporal and spatial ambit of Asia. The importance that this originary sovereign autonomy held gave Asia itself a corollary importance in the Katipunan's political imaginary. The Katipunan's initiation rites included a formulaic, performative recitation of the Katipunan's promulgated interpretation of Tagalog history. Quote, "What was the condition of the Katagalugan, the Tagalog people, in early times?" the initiator asked. To this, the initiate had been coached to respond that the Filipinos had their own civilization, alphabet, and religion before the Spaniards arrived. They enjoyed political liberty, used artillery, wore clothes of silk, and maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with their Asian neighbors. Not only Asia generally, Bonifacio also employed Japan specifically as a powerful symbol of Asian achievement and freedom from the West, in much the same way that the propaganda movement did. The famous rallying cry attributed to Bonifacio begins with a primary assertion, quote, "In the early days when the Spaniards had not yet set foot on our soil, this Katagalugan was governed by our compatriots and enjoyed a life of great abundance, prosperity, and peace. She maintained good relations with her neighbors, especially with the Japanese, and traded with them in goods of all kinds. As a result, everyone had wealth and behaved with honor," end quote. For its part, the Katipunan tried repeatedly to contact the Japanese government and to collaborate with Japanese sympathizers to their cause. Though ultimately official Japanese aid never came, Japanese sympathizers were always to be found, and they did render unofficial aid. I'll now tally this Filipino Asianist organizing to get a sense of Pan-Asianism in motion. This is not all solidarity, unity, and brotherhood. Pan-Asianism was a romantic fantasy and trafficked in emotionality and bonds of friendship, upon which the networks of aid and political organizing rested. But it was grounded in power calculations and instrumentalized by those in colonized Southeast Asia for nationalist purposes. In the newly racialized geopolitical intellectual framework, the colonized believed this racial solidarity necessary to their political projects. Japanese Foreign Minister Okuma obtained permission from the US government for military shishi Captain Tokizawa to accompany US troops in the Philippines as an observer. Although in the Philippines with Americans, Tokizawa freely passed a lot of sensitive information back to the Filipino revolutionaries, including the fact that he was told the Americans would attack Manila 3 days hence. In 1898, once Aguinaldo was setting up his government and the First Philippine Republic, he named former propagandist Mariano Ponce the Philippine Foreign Emissary to Japan, a mission that ranked 4th out of 28 budget items of the Aguinaldo government. Ponce lived in Japan from June 1898 to March 1901. He met Japanese officials and persons of all levels and joined and attended meetings of various Asianist societies, which included Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Siamese, and Filipinos as members. And he gained the patronage of prominent Japanese politicians. Within the societies, the problems of Korea and the Philippines were topics of active discussion. In Japan, Ponce met the Chinese Confucian scholar Kang Yu-wei, who led the 100 Days of Reform, the exiled leaders of the Korean Reform Movement, Korean government, and Prince Park Byung-hyo, as well as the Chinese revolutionary and future president of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen, with whom he became lifelong friends. Ponce fielded individual Japanese supporters to train the Philippine Revolutionary Army. Several Japanese volunteers sailed to the Philippines to train Aguinaldo's army, along with arms and ammunition. The Hong Kong Committee was also successful in procuring arms for the First Philippine Republic. Important to this Pan-Asianism in motion was affect. At a dinner party hosted by prominent Japanese politician Nuakai Ki, Ponce met Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen asked his Japanese friends Miyazaki Toten and Hirayama Shu to help arrange a purchase of arms for the Philippine Revolution. Miyazaki says in 1899, Sun asked him, quote, "Is there any way you can get guns and ammunition to the Philippines? There's a representative of the Independence Army in Yokohama. Since I planned to go to the Philippines with you, I visited this man and revealed my secret support for him. He was overjoyed and promptly entrusted me with a great matter, the import of guns. It was our very first meeting, and see how he trusted me. I must do everything within my power for this cause. Moreover, this man's spirit is exactly the same as ours. I want to ask you to use all your strength for these valorous Filipinos," end quote. Here, the role of emotion and affinity is pivotal. See how he trusted me, forming bonds that would underpin the political ideology of Asian solidarity through fantasy and affection. Miyazaki wrote, quote, "My heart was instantly aflame. Soon Hirayama and I made secret plans, and I resolved to reveal these to Naki and to tap his wisdom," end quote. Note again the role of emotion. Indeed, Miyazaki saw himself as romantically working for the region of East Asia, which he understood in racial terms, writing of himself as, quote, "romantically as always, a chivalrous hero, working for the colored races of mankind, and not as the servant of his country nor his emperor," end quote. Ponce's stay in Japan was a success mostly in terms of delivering intelligence to the Hong Kong junta and in shaping foreign Asian opinion on the rightness of the Philippine Revolution. His work, Cuestión Filipina, was serialized in Keiko Ranipo, published as a book in Tokyo, translated to Chinese, published in Shanghai, and even reissued as late as 1913. Rebecca Carl argues that for Chinese intellectuals, it was this piece by Ponce that first persuasively cast colonialism as a global discursive problem, a characterization that not only facilitated the universalization of the Philippine national experience well beyond its particularities, but one that endured well beyond the duration of the Philippine Revolution itself. Indeed, you have Asian leaders as late as Sukarno in Indonesia referencing the Philippine Revolution and Rizal as inspiration. In terms of his Pan-Asianism, one of the most important moments in Ponce's Japan-based correspondence is his request to the First Philippine Republic in 1898 that the Filipino and Chinese revolutionaries work together and help each other's causes with Japanese support. Quote, "The view of the Japanese in putting us in contact, Chinese reformers and Filipino revolutionaries, is that we help each other mutually," Ponce explained. For the Japanese government's suggestion, Kang Yu-wei of the Chinese Reformist Party wished to establish a working agreement with the First Philippine Republic. Quote, "If, for example, we prepare some of our isolated ports to be deposits of weapons, ammunition, and supplies of the Chinese revolutionaries, from which points their military can arm itself, in exchange for this service, it would be easy for us to secure first use of the weapons in our deposit," Ponce explained. Additionally, this partnership could also eventually provide the Filipino government with a new source of loan money. Moreover, Ponce argued, quote, "It is a just cause, legitimate. Its triumph would be of great importance for the future of the Far East, and is another reason why we should not look upon this reformist movement with indifference," end quote. This was something that Ponce truly believed, that the Philippine nation and Philippine Revolution were part of a larger Asian community and were central actors in an Asian anti-imperial, anti-Western history. Pan-Asianism and the example of Meiji Japan through the assertion of the unique fruits of Asian culture and proof of successful Asian modernization supported the legitimacy and perceived viability of Asian nationalist claims of rightful sovereignty over their countries in spite of their country's relative failure in a social Darwinist geopolitical competition. The content of the Pan-Asian imaginary and proposition on the part of the periphery, however, did not merely amount to a new strategy within the same social Darwinist struggle. The peripheral Pan-Asianists asserted that the Asia within Pan-Asia would embody a rightful moral grounding to geopolitics, which they judged as lacking in the international sphere, and which they asserted was the unique offering of Asia. This dichotomy pitted a materialist West against a spiritual East. These peripheral Pan-Asianists often interpret what was a potentially imperial element embedded within the concept of Pan-Asian alliance as instead affecting a new diplomacy and new transnational political arrangement through a federation of equals, albeit knitted together through self-interest in what was a racially charged and materially unequal amoral competition. It was these positive visions that they believed would protect their constituent nationalisms, and it was this alternate vision of the global international world order that they put into contest against the prevailing Western one. This continued into the Philippine-American War phase of the Philippine Revolution with, in 1898, Clemente Zuleta publishing an illustrated magazine called La Malasia that covered topics relating to the Malay race, and Gregorio Aguilera and other ilustrados editing Columnas Volantes de la Federación Malaya, beginning in 1899, which aimed to serve as an organ for the Filipino people marching with and leading the Malayan people as a single federation. Apolinario Mabini himself published an important article in 1899 in which he declared that the revolution, quote, had as its sole objective and final goal the aspiration to maintain alive and bright in Oceania the torch of liberty and civilization, so that, illuminating the gloomy night in which today the Malay race lies debased and degraded, the revolution will show the road to its social emancipation, end quote. Written by Aguinaldo's closest advisor and the first Philippine Republic's Minister of Foreign Affairs, this is the strongest statement we have on the deeply racial interpretive framework and pan-Malay vision that were operative in the Philippine Revolution. In a letter to a friend written on November 3, 1899, Mabini reasoned that God allowed for the existence of avarice because it gave him a tool through which to extend civilization and to eventually humiliate the proud and exalt the humble. This explained the existence of unequal progress across civilizations at different points in time, but unified them as existing within a single universal narrative. Universal civilization is carried continuously and housed by many, indifferent to whether it lands east or west. Mabini theorized a role for inequality of progress across cultures. It allowed for the inevitable process of creeping decadence and decay, not to stifle universal civilization. At the point of decay, a youthful, adapted, different nation would take up the mantle of universal civilization and breathe into it new life. While the propagandists had turned to history in order to diminish the importance of the Philippines' perceived cultural and racial inferiority, which they now theorize as a temporary historicized state, as well as to tie the Philippines to a history of past and universal greatness through association with Asia, the Malay race, and the rising power of Japan, Mabini took their theorization of universal civilization, which was oriented toward the past, and built into it a causal process that predicted the Philippines' future greatness. This intellectual move mirrors the one that took place more broadly in the transition from the propaganda movement to the Philippine Revolution. The propaganda movement had established a foundation for a Filipino nation built upon reclaimed Asian history and a reawakened racial Malay consciousness upon which a Filipino nation could stand. The Philippine Revolution of the Katipuneros took this intellectual armature, which was oriented toward the past, and prescribed a future for it, theorizing and mobilizing the action that would achieve it. Though the Philippine Revolution eventually ended unsuccessfully, Asianism continued to inspire certain pockets of Filipino discourse and world of ideas, albeit from the sidelines. After World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution and Wilsonian principles undercut the international appeal of Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism. After World War II, the suffering caused by Japanese occupation and the new exigencies of decolonization and strident domestic nationalisms disenchanted Southeast Asia with the idea of Japanese-led Pan-Asianism. Yet the distinct mode of critique and alternative visions of cosmopolitanism, modernity, and world order that Pan-Asianism represented were neither unimportant nor short-lived in Southeast Asia. Not only did they abet and inform what would become the post-war discourses of Third Worldism and Pan-Malayism in the Philippines, but they are also embedded in the very foundations of the Filipino nation. So I can stop here if we no longer have time, or I can say a few closing remarks. Leloy, do you have an indication as to how we're doing for time?
Feel free to go a little bit longer if you like. About
Okay.
10 more minutes, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Sorry.
No,
You can go a bit long. I was talking, but yeah, please go a bit
Okay.
longer because we have until 6:30, and I would encourage also the audience to start writing down your questions already, so we can jump straight into the questions after Nicole finishes.
Okay, great. So I just want to close by saying, while turning to East-East relations and contact between peripheries, among others, my book does not occasion a simple reorientation of historical attention away from the West in order to recover something internal within and to Asian history. It's rather an attempt to recover a wider range of structures of thought, Eastern, Western, imperial, anti-colonial, peripheral core, involved in Filipino conceptualizations of a universal human history of civilization, and how Filipinos carved and grounded their constructed national places within it. Indeed, I've turned to Asia not only to bear out the more complex world that existed beyond the bilateral accounts of history. While the modern nation state was a Western invention, it was often globalized through the work of non-Western activists, thinkers, and revolutionaries. The unattended backdrop to my book is the history of the rise of the nation state as the legitimate political form. The particular logics, priorities, and conditions of power in the Southeast Asian periphery at the turn of the 20th century make clear social Darwinism's role in this history as it occurred in the region, where and when the world appeared to be arrayed into two camps, making more complex, dualistic, internationalist, experimentation, and racial solidarity seemed necessary and natural to constituent Asian nations' existence and survival. Many Filipino thinkers and revolutionaries grounded anti-colonial political legitimacy in supposedly inalienable understandings of place and nation, but like their Vietnamese neighbors, among others, they fortified such national groundings within wider racial camps, which were assumed to share various interests, if not outright civilizational destinies. Further, attention to place is one avenue for us to see the ways in which the globalization and proliferation of the nation-state form in Asia was not only derivative and defensive phenomena vis-a-vis the West, though those aspects were also underway. There was also important positive political imagining and world-making underway too. Positive political imagining worked to make nationalisms, which, as I said, were often arrayed in broad, general Western Enlightenment grammar, more specific and capable of mobilizing people. Place also brought imagined historical, cultural, and racial specificity to bear upon anti-colonial nationalisms. And similarly, anti-colonial nationalism's transnational racial solidarity wasn't only a defensive position in preparation for what was perceived to be a coming race war, or realpolitik understanding of the racialized nature of modern power within a social Darwinist world. Though, of course, there are both of those things as well. Race also served a positive function in the anti-colonial argumentation for and construction of nations. Anti-colonial nationalisms formed in the interstices of the colonized and colonizers' imaginaries. So it's no surprise that while often arguing against or subverting the Western epistemologies into their anti-colonial nationalism, particularly with regard to race, European Orientalism statements of difference between East and West obtained not only as intellectual planks supporting Western imperialism and racism, but also then positively and defensively as the foundations for Asia's unique role within a shared universal history of civilization.
Oh, there's one question from John Soriano. Okay. While the concept of a Malay race is no longer accepted, the concept of Asian still remains to be useful for some reason. Are there still advantages to situating the Philippines as specifically Asian as opposed to globally Southern or otherwise international?
Thank you for the question. I don't wish to, I think, make value judgments on different geographies of political affinity or different epistemologies situating different regions and the knowledge production and identities and affiliation. I think I'm just trying to track how they develop over time and to recover a dimension to the foundational moment of Philippine history that has been missing from our understanding, which has been very domestically and nationally contained or very Westernized and Eurocentric. I think that Asia is a really interesting concept because it's so undefined and loose throughout the 20th century, really, and throughout the 19th century as well. And it's, you can track its definition and its changes, and it's very different all over different parts of the world, but it's kind of like this blank canvas upon which you can project your fantasies and fears. So it becomes a great index of different global paradigm shifts over the 20th century in a really interesting way into understanding a lot of those different fantasies and fears at the global level as well as at the local level.
John says, thank you for the excellent talk and response. And Lester Ebrada says, good morning. Are there other questions? All right, okay, from Carl Cheng Chua. Hi, Carl. As the Philippine revolutionaries are acquiring Japanese Pan-Asianism, which moves towards Japan's rule of a Western concept of modernity, can you comment towards this Asianness vis-a-vis your current conclusion?
I'm not sure I understand exactly what the question asks. If it's about the nature of modernity, I think there's a very extensive academic literature on this, on the idea of multiple modernities, on the possibility of alternative modernities. And it was a very productive debate around the turn of the 21st century. And it came in a certain way out of the prior century of Asianist thinking and taking seriously the idea of Asia's differing epistemology. However, that debate ended up, while being very productive, didn't conclusively get anywhere because of the impossibility of conclusively defining modernity itself. And so I think there are a lot of people who believe that there is no alternative modernity, that it's just modernity still. And there, we have not yet come upon anything that's truly counter or alternative. It's just different strands of the same. And this is a very, very long debate, and I don't think we need to go into it, but there is an existing literature trying to interrogate the idea of an Asian modernity and if there is something different.
There's a question from the chat among panelists. It's from Sarah. She wants you to reflect on this week's 500 years anniversary of Magellan's landing. Is there some way to tie together the Europeanness of the commemoration, or to think about the Europeanness of the commemoration alongside Philippine nationalism?
I think there's a way in which that that moment, which is taken as another sort of foundation, the other foundational moment in Philippine history. If I've just talked about one, that's the other prior. And there's a way in which a lot of counts begin there. It has overwritten and overdetermined in many narratives of the region more generally, the Philippines' removal and difference within the region. And there are lots of very sophisticated analyses on this. Anthony Reid and Victor Lieberman all in some way adhere to this idea that the Philippines becomes a thing apart because of the Christianization of the Philippines and the different track that it ends up going on for so long. However, of course, the actual Spanish import and impact in the Philippines has been deeply questioned in Philippine nationalist writings for a very, very long time. And you can see just by basically the number of Filipinos who end up actually speaking Spanish versus in Latin America is completely opposite. At one point did more than 5% of the population at its height speak Spanish. And so that shows the depth of the Spanish impact to a certain degree. And you find, basically in archaeological remains, evidence of Chinese pottery and ceramics, going back centuries. So I think that it's a good moment to question our narratives about what that foundational moment and that colonization did or didn't do. Of course, it had an immense impact, but this is a question that we've been attuned to for a long time, and one that I think we should continue to ask. And also, when you take out the question of religion, what else do you have? There's a lot of people who think that the main Spanish impact was basically just religious, and I don't think that that's necessarily true. But also, what work is religion doing versus other things? Because if it's just religion, there's also the syncretic nature of Filipino Catholicism, which has its own unique features, given the historical interaction with it and the Filipinos' negotiation with appropriation and use of it, which wasn't just a one-way imposition of another's world vision. It wasn't just that kind of hegemonic reception.
Okay. Next question is from Pat Takudao. Thank you to the Ateneo History Department for showing up and asking questions. From where did Fascio Mabini and the rest get their ideas concerning Pan-Asianism? Was it through their formal education in the Philippines, or through published works or other channels, perhaps?
In one way, it's really by thinking comparatively, I think, about colonialism. At least that's what I found from their writings. And in a certain way, it isn't unrelated to what Rebecca Carl describes for the Chinese thinkers that, just at the same time when they're thinking through the material inequality they see in the world order, and they're watching others in Asia negotiating with the same kinds of problems and conditions. So you have a lot of the Filipino illustrados and propagandists referring to their Asian neighbors basically through their colonial overlords. So those living under French rule, those living under British rule. And so that becomes a way in which they start to order the region around them and the differences. And so I think that starts to set their idea of Asia. And then it's also through interaction with racism that they end up sort of reconstructing the idea of Asia and then Asian race. They want to be able to claim this kind of generalized ancient Chinese grandeur as something that they are part of. So they have an entry into universal civilization and its narrative through that means. And so it's a very generalized understanding of ancient China, while at the same time in the present distancing themselves from current day China in a certain way, at least from the Chinese immigrants. Yeah, so I think it's happening on multiple levels. Also, it comes from reading a lot of European scholarship. In the same way that they were reading European scholarship on the Filipinos, they were also reading Dutch scholarship on the Malays in general, and that helped form a lot of their groundings for what they would later define as Malay and not.
Thank you. Next question is from Marian Rosas. Hi, Marian. How does your analysis of race-driven Pan-Asianism as the foundational moment of the Philippine nation bring in the equally race-driven Latino mestizaje aspiration abroad in the Filipinas during the same period?
Yes, so I think that one of the ways in which mestizaje obtains within what I'm discussing is this concept of adaptation within a social Darwinist frame, and the ability to mix and to take from other races and other cultures and other civilizations in a way that is adaptive, and that is a sort of evolutionary technique and a competitive technique. And there's a way in which the illustrators theorize this as a racial attribute, something that can distinguish the Filipinos from the colonizers, and a strategy that they should lean on in their struggles and in this sort of geopolitical situation. I went to Cuba to look at the archives there, and I was hoping very much in the early stages of this book to try to bring out a Cuban-Filipino connection. And unfortunately, what I found in the archives is that while the Cubans were aware of what the Filipinos were doing and were following, the same way that the Filipinos were aware of what the Cubans were doing and were following, and there was sort of support on both sides, and a kind of unproblematic support, which I thought was very interesting. There was like an unproblematic use of we, of nosotros, when referring to one another. There wasn't any evidence of actual contact and exchange and correspondence. So I think there was emulation specifically then, but unfortunately, yeah, not the evidence I was looking for.
Okay, the next question is Silun Huang. It's curious why Filipinos subscribe to Japanese Pan-Asianism rather than cooperate with the Chinese to articulate the concept.
So I think that it's to do with basically Japan's being seen as the symbol and savior of Asia, because of its ability within a single generation, essentially within a decade, to modernize and become a modern great power, a global power, recognizable even to the Europeans. And that was acquired, essentially great power recognition and status by the West. This was something that China, though it had been admired and lauded and an obsession of the West for centuries, was not doing. That was a different civilization that you could rest on for sort of historical importance and grandeur, when you're looking for the kinds of fictions that a nationalism wants, this sort of past greatness and this narrative about purpose and belonging and civilization. But in the present, they wanted this symbol of power, of this modern power, and it in their racialized understanding and their social Darwinist sort of approach to geopolitics, it was seen that only your racial kind would help you. So of your racial kind, Japan became the natural potential ally and the natural power to learn from, because they had successfully sort of removed Western encroachment from within their territory while preserving an Asian culture. And later on, going into sort of the 1910s, you have different Filipino writers talking about how, and very, very American leaning, actually, Filipino writers discussing how what they liked about Japan's modernization was that it was performative, that actually nothing changed in Japan at all. And it was just an outer external form that was able to show and interact with the West and protected their culture on the inside without actually having to change.
All right. Next question is from Larry Ashman. Not being a Philippine studies specialist, I would ask how your historical approach compares to that in Philippine school textbooks. Interesting question.
Actually, I think Leloy can answer that better than I can, as he's been involved in actually writing a Philippine high school textbook. So Leloy.
No, I have no expertise in this regard as well, so please.
You have direct experience in this regard, actually.
No, I haven't done a history textbook, so that's my excuse.
Well, I would say that for my understanding, it is not represented. This is not a dimension that's represented. Not even in the academic scholarship is this really a dimension that's represented. I think for when I talk about the book with others who don't study the Philippines, it almost seems to them like, duh. Well, of course, of course, the Philippines is going to look to Japan, and of course, it's going to want to sort of within this competition look for racial kinds. And of course, the Spanish were barely there, and there were just a couple of priests. And of course, they've always traded with Japan and their Malay neighbors and China for centuries. So like, duh. And I think it misses how for the Philippine narratives and the Philippine discourse, this is really not something that's widely represented. And the newness of what I'm saying gets lost sometimes when I speak to non-Filipinos. We've had a very, very domestic and sort of nationally oriented historiography and historical understanding for a very long time, and a very Eurocentric and Western one. And I wanted to go back to, sort of the main moment in Philippine history and show how even in the most discussed moment in Philippine history, going to the same sources that everyone went to, I'm able to show this other dimension that just wasn't attended to by others before. And I think that's because of a Eurocentric lens or an imperial lens, as well as a nationalist lens. When I say nationalist, I mean in a very domestic, limited way.
I think that's perfect, because the next question is exactly about that, because Tech Alvara is asking if your argument is kind of contrast to the nationalist interpretation of the Philippine Revolution. Why do you think, and she also asks, why do you think that is the predominant interpretation of the revolution, and how did that interpretation contribute to our blindness about the revolution's Asian heritage?
Yeah, I think it's basically a 20th century story, right? Because the history that I just gave you leaves off kind of in the beginning days of the US imperialism in the Philippines. And the US is so successful in co-opting the revolutionary spirit and aspirations and basically channeling it through their colonial political tutelage, through benevolent assimilation. And so it neuters a lot of these aspirations. It doesn't kid it entirely. And there's, as I say from the sidelines, Asianism continues to inspire. So that's one thread. And then as you have sort of American ascendance over the 20th century, it only becomes a more sort of natural power calculation on the part of the Filipinos to try to ally themselves with the US and to try to rest on that special relationship in order to gain more in the international sphere. So that Americanizes the US Americanizes the Philippines in a certain thread. At the same time, Japan starts to act more like a Western imperial power than the next savior of Asia. And so that disaffects Asian revolutionaries from this idea of Japanese-led Pan-Asianism, but it doesn't stop them from trying to get Japan back to what they believed, at least in the periphery, in peripheral, sort of the peripheral Pan-Asianists, to get Japan back to what they saw to be embodying the true emancipatory spirit of Pan-Asianism. And I think it's also this disenchantment. And then also, what happens under Japanese occupation that then moves a lot of these prior Asianist thinkers to move away from Pan-Asianism to go toward the more ethnically limited Pan-Malayism, but then also the more international third worldism that comes in the post-war decolonizing period. So you see these different scales of affinity moving and changing over time.
Thank you. Here's a naughty question from Patricio Abinales, as usual. What did Ponce et al. Think of Showa nationalism, often referred to as Japanese fascism? Any of its threads find their way into Filipino nationalism?
Yeah, I think that there's a way in which Ponce forgiving. He's quite forgiving of the Japanese example. And also, I must say that everywhere, including in Japan at the time, the fascist elements of their political ideology are actually not seen in Japan, are not seen as different from the prior Western ideologies. It's just the more updated version. It's the newest political technique to modernizing, essentially. And you see it, you see it successfully in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. And so it is not taken, with the same kind of value judgment that we place on it now after World War II. So at the time, it was just seen as an update of, of prior ideologies and, a new science of rule. And so that's the Japanese side. Once you get to the Philippine side, there is a running discourse in the Philippines on the idea of kind of martial discipline and the need for it in order to tame an unruly populace, an unruly society, and an unruly archipelago, and an unruly government too. So that is a running thread. And it's something that Jose Laurel specifically interacts with and talks about. And he says that kind of discipline and order, the Japanese discipline and order, is something that he admires. He says that, there's a way in which wartime can mimic some of that because it compresses time, and changes that would require multiple generations can be achieved much more quickly because of this change in conditions. So it's an interesting question and one that hasn't died.
Thank you. And the next question is from Stephen Acabado. Hey Buboy. Thanks, Nicole. Fascinating discussion about the affect and the propaganda movement. My question is focused on the dominance of the Tagalog in the revolutionary movement and the diverse Philippine cultures. How did the multi-ethnic nature of colonial Philippine society play a role in the search or motivation for the Pan-Asian society? Aside from Indonesia, other state and colonized entities in Asia include a majority ethno-linguistic group. And in some sense, as your talk mentioned, that Filipino identity is relatively recent. We're still trying to figure out what Filipino is culturally, and how should we highlight this diversity in our respective works?
Thank you so much for your question. I often think of Isabelo de los Reyes when I try to think through what role Tagalog played within the propaganda movement, because he is one of the more outspoken propagandists to basically challenge the Tagalog majoritarian kind of dominance. And he keeps pinpointing the ways in which, certain representations do not accord with the larger archipelago and are not yet truly Filipino and are basically Tagalog dressing up as Filipino. And another thing he does is actually try to localize the understanding of Filipino, and he turns to folklore, and he documents a lot of Ilocano superstitions and customs and other sort of localized features, and he basically embarrasses Rizal and the others who say, don't publish this. The Europeans now think we're backwards and and superstitious, and you're only affirming what they think. And Isabelo says, but this is what what is practiced locally. Why should we be ashamed of it? This is what I am, and I'm not trying to dress up for another. And so I think there's a class element there, as well as a global sort of like hierarchizing, a response to a hierarchizing that makes a lot of the sort of Tagalog majority try to protect their representation abroad. And it's primarily, they're thinking about the reception abroad rather than internally. And I think that under Bonifacio, the Philippine Revolution is very Tagalog. And under Aguinaldo, it is able to, it moves from being what was basically a Tagalog revolution to something that tries to be a little bit more Filipino. And there are other aspects of the revolution that I don't talk about that should be discussed, like the brief republic in the Visayas, for example. And I think that, in a sort of in a more capacious discussion of all of this, hopefully other aspects would be brought into play. But I was still following the main narrative to discuss a new dimension to that main narrative.
or the cantonment in Iloilo, right? These various other foci of the Philippine Revolution, which might not actually be part of the Philippine Revolution.
Right, exactly.
And then, of course, Don Belong, Isabella de los Reyes, he makes his argument about an inclusive vision of Filipino, and Rizal repudiates him and claims that he has an excessive level of Ilocanism in his work, right? So anyway, thanks for that. Next question is from, sorry, I just had to say something.
No.
Yeah, the next question is from Christina Newhart. Thank you for your fascinating and important lecture, Nicole. Philippine identity is such a multi-layered, non-linear construct. In your research, was there any particular finding that surprised, delighted, or challenged you personally in understanding the nuances of Philippine identity? Such a beautiful question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's more articulately worded than the answer I'm about to give you. So I think one of the surprises for me was the way in which race was naturalized in terms of being tied to climate and to the environment. I thought that was a really interesting aspect, which I hadn't read about before. The idea that in a sort of multilinear evolutionism, your race is specific to the place in which it evolved. So there are constant ways of thinking depending on that environment. And so then when you're dislocated, that's why you're alienated. There's something truer to being at home, and there's a way in which, so foreign imposition is always going to be unstable because it's foreign, because it is not what grew up within that place on a natural level. And I thought that the scientific explanations that they rely on was also super interesting when they talk about water vapor and this spheroidal state and layers of clay and lime. I thought that was super interesting and not something that I had expected going into the archives.
And here, Nicole, is the question, is your favorite question about the book, this time beautifully phrased by Professor Peter Zinnemann. Most of the data presented in the talk comes from elite discourse. If you were to look at less elitist sources about political identity from the same period, how significant would these various forms of Pan-Asianisms appear? I say that's her favorite question with some sense of irony, but you can tell us why.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter, for that. But it's a very important question. And I think in many ways, the history of the founding of the nation state is going to be an elite narrative in Southeast Asia, because largely in Southeast Asia, the nation state is an elite tool. And I think that's an understanding I've come to within Southeast Asia. Within the Philippines specifically, one of the things I actually try to do is to break down this distinction between a sort of global, cosmopolitan, international elite crowd and a conservative, nation-oriented, rooted in place, local crowd. And I try and show the ways in which those two things are actually co-constituted in here, and they're entangled. And it's actually not only those who had the ability to travel and to go to Japan and to study in Europe who are thinking about the international. So I opened the book with basically snippets of the 1880s, 1870s, when rumors are circulating amongst the millenarian groups in rural Visayas, in the hinterland, about how a German steamship is about to arrive and say that Spain doesn't own the Visayas. And there's another sort of millenarian leader in the Visayas who is rumored to be able to summon coins from America. And he frees his followers from the need to pay Spanish tribute, and they organize their own upland regime. So there are ways in which ideas of social regeneration in the Philippines in this time period are interacting with the international in ways that aren't only designated for the elite who travel. Even in very, very localized rural settings, there is an interaction there that's happening. So I wanted to break down that kind of opposition that can sometimes happen in global history. Now I'm looking at what is avowedly an elite project in terms of Pan-Asianism, for sure. And that's not to exclude the possibility that there were other understandings of Asia and even geographies of political affinity from a different class or geographic dimension in the Philippines. So for example, I would love to see someone write a book, since I could not, on basically looking at all the sailors and the merchants who were going up and down Asia, unbrokenly, essentially, for centuries, and that never stopped. Or the Muslim Mindanao and the connections to the Malay world and the Muslim Malay world that were also remained unbroken. And I think you would find wonderful sort of alternate visions there as well, and political sort of geographies of political affinity that have Asian circuits and scales there too. And I hope someone does it.
Sorry, I was muted. Next question from BB Monkey. BB Monkey, that's cute. Even within and among Filipinos, there is also a sort of identity crisis in the region. For example, I am from Davao, but my parents are from Pangasinan and from Cebu. My dad is from Pangasinan, but cannot speak Pangasinense. I think the politically correct term is Pangasinan to refer to the language. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, he speaks Ilocano, so we speak 4 different languages at home. We are native Visayan speakers, but we live in Davao, which is not in Cebu. So how do we make sense of this kind of identity formation and discourse within and among us? Thank you, learning a lot.
Yeah. I think it just speaks to, the fictions of the nation state, right? And the idea of a central narrative, right? And the ability to speak for others.
Yeah. Okay.
But
Now I
it
get.
doesn't have to rise to that level, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to have a central fiction.
Yeah.
We could just admit to it, right?
I agree. I'm gonna divert the discussion a little bit because I have a question, and I asked you this when you guested in my class here at Berkeley, which is, there's this classic Ben Anderson comparative observation about the Philippine Revolution. It's the last revolution in Spanish America, but it's the first revolution in Asia. So there's a kind of in-betweenness there. And one could even say it's the kind of missing link, and this is my take on it. It's the kind of missing link that ties in the Creole-led revolutions from the American Revolution, of course, which Anderson calls a Creole Revolution, to the Mexican Revolution and the other revolutions in Latin America. It ties those revolutions in with the 20th century revolutions, many of which are kind of Marxist or socialist inspired, or at the very least 20th century anti-colonial, third worldist, whatever you call it. Do you think your work illuminates that kind of in-betweenness of the Philippine Revolution? Does it say something about that tension? Does it say something about its nature as this kind of missing link?
That's a really interesting question, and not one that I explicitly interacted with. I mentioned prior the kind of the insufficiency of the Creole, sort of the prior Creole kind of revolutionary stirrings in Luzon, which only ended up being Luzon based and were decidedly urban. But I think that what transpires here also is in that switch is a kind of deeper racialization of the international sphere, and I think that's something that's a little bit different there, and and race thinking has at this point developed in a very different way and has hardened and has become biological, in a way that in the 18th and early 19th century revolutions, it didn't play the same role. And once you get to the late 19th and early 20th century, there's a belief across the globe, not just in Asia, of a coming race war. You have the British talking about it, you have the Japanese talking about it, you have Cambodians talking about it, and it adds a different element. And I think that there is probably also a way in which there's a, no, I don't want to say that, I think that's not right. I don't want to say that it foregrounds the later sort of Laurel politics of racial stock, and national kind of regeneration through that. But I do think that what I can say is that you're right. There's a missing link there. And that once you get the globalization and proliferation of the nation state form, there's a big change once it moves the world over and becomes basically the only available political unit with legitimacy. And there's a narrative there about how that happens. And I think that Asia has a strong role to play, and I think that the Philippines plays a very early role, and one that can be missed because of its earlier, because of its temporal sort of situation. We often talk about sort of decolonization, as you know, you've touched on this too, decolonization in a post-war, sort of second half of the 20th century sense. But in the Philippines, it's much earlier. And so there's an interaction there that predates a lot of the post-war wranglings with different ideas.
Are there any more? That's perfect. Thank you very much. Are there any more questions?
Alex has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. This is from, let me see. Sorry, I can't find it. This is from Alex from Mabanta. Can't find it. Sorry. Sarah, do you mind asking it? I can't.
I'll turn myself on.
Oh yeah, I found it. Sorry. How does the Philippine Revolution inspire or interact with revolutions and racial formations elsewhere in Asia? For example, what impacts does the Philippine Revolution have on Vietnam?
Yeah. So the final chapter in my book talks about the afterlives of the Philippine Revolution and traces its reverberations actually throughout the region. And I think one of the things that's important to look at here is the way in which Southeast Asia, we as sort of scholars of Southeast Asia, always are the first to say basically Southeast Asia is an invented concept. It's a political construct. It comes out of World War II military divisions, and it's an imperial construct. And then basically there are these sort of like hollow Cold War regional institutions that come up and try to knit it together. And there are sort of like area studies scholars who try and justify their discipline by looking at what can be in common, what can be held in common. And so we tend to dismiss the region of Southeast Asia as this sort of invented region, this political construct. But there are also ways in which there's an actual history there of comparative and shared colonial experiences that knit together the region, as well as anti-colonial collaboration and observation. And so this history, I think, is important, this Philippine Revolution in history, to show the ways in which different Southeast Asians are starting to think about their shared and comparable experience. And they start to collaborate, and they're in the same Asianist societies together, and they're thinking through each other's problems. And then within Southeast Asia specifically, you have lots of different leaders, especially in the Malay world, referencing Rizal and the Philippine Revolution as direct inspirations. And today, even in Malaysia, you'll meet people who are named Rizal, R-E-E-Z-A-L, and other spellings in honor of Jose Rizal, who is often referred to as the greatest Malay. So I think it has an effect in sort of knitting together the concept of a region that is anachronistic, sure, they're not thinking about it in this time period, but it does give a foundation for the later construct on which, for that later construct to rest on. And it opens a dimension that isn't just a sort of imperial or war construct.
Of course, twice Prime Minister in waiting, Anwar Ibrahim, was very invested in this idea of Rizal as pride of the Malayan race, right? As problematic as that sounds. Yeah. I've got one more question, and maybe you can end with my question unless there's another question. But there's another difference between textbook historiography and your book, which is that you call the phenomenon the long Philippine Revolution, whereas in a Philippine history textbook, it's the Philippine Revolution of 1896 and then the Filipino-American War of 1898-1899 until 1902. I think it's absolutely correct that you call it the long Philippine Revolution because of the continuities there, just the continuity between the Malolos government and then the guerrilla army that eventually emerges. So it's absolutely correct. But there may have been one shift, and I wonder if you found the shift, which is that prior to the Filipino-American War, Filipinos were likewise invested in the idea that Americans would help them. And Rizal, in fact, talked about Pan-Asianism, but he also talked about George Washington as the greatest defender of liberty the world has ever seen, right? He said that here in San Francisco, in fact. It was one of his first observations upon arriving in San Francisco. This was even after he was excluded from entry because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Anyway, is there a sense that the disillusionment with the United States during the Filipino-American War pushed the revolutionaries closer to Pan-Asianism as a discourse?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that what's interesting is that you find the same actually in Vietnam at this point, and in French Indochina, where the Vietnamese are talking about George Washington, they're talking about the American Revolution. But then they talk about these American revolutionary figures in a Confucian sense. So there's this kind of like Asianization of these figures, and they're crafting them, recasting them in this in the mode of a sort of Confucian morality, and the kind of and a sort of knight errant as well. And so there's a lot of playing around with these historical allusions and predecessors and inspirations. In the Philippines, I think you're absolutely right that disillusionment with the US has a market effect. However, I would say that there were others who were already very wary and thought it sort of chimeric that the US would come to the Philippines' aid, and I think did not look upon that with great hope from the beginning. And I think so those sides were always present even from the beginning. And also one of the things that pushes, I think, the Filipino thinkers toward a certain Asian leading is basically the Sino-Japanese War, and seeing Japan defeat China there gives them a renewed understanding and a renewed attention to Asia and to the possibilities of Asia.
Thank you very much. I have room for one more question, but if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Nicole for spending this morning with us. And again, I'd like to remind everyone that in the Philippines, that her book is offered at a 20% discount by Ateneo de Manila University Press. So please visit their online store at www.shopee.ph/Ateneo Press or email books.unipress@ateneo.edu. This is a very auspicious day. Thank you very much, Nicole. And on behalf of Berkeley Center for Southeast Asian Studies, UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the Filipino and Philippine Studies Working Group, and Ateneo de Manila University Press, congratulations and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much to all of you, to UCLA, to Berkeley, to your centers, to your working group, and to Ateneo de Manila University Press. I'm so honored to have spent this morning with you all and to be speaking to you all. And it's a live stream fulfilled. So thank you so much.